We are talking Entropy. This one is directed by Cameron Hale. He co-wrote this with his brother Scott Hale. Scott Hale actually has a role within the movie. Now this is a very low budget horror film that in some ways is reminiscent of the somewhat classic movie Society. At least the conclusion of the movie is a little bit like that. So what is the story? It focuses on this young woman who we learn at the beginning of the film has been diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and obviously she's very upset about it. Now her kind of girlfriend, it convinces her to go to this kind of party with a kind of a group of her friends, and we learn that this kind of group of people, all of whom have had some type of medical issue and are kind of like a little bit of considered outcasts in some ways by their own admission. And we learn that this kind of group of friends may well be part of some type of cult, and we have this kind of party scene where things get a little bit kind of heated, shall we say, and true intentions are revealed. And what will happen? Well, you're going to have to watch the movie and find out, but suffice to say, if you're a fan of Society, then this may well interest you. So what do we think that works in this movie's favour? Now, it is an extremely low budget film, but I've got to say, I think the idea behind the movie is relatively solid and somewhat kind of, I would say, I don't know if I'll call it unique exactly, but somewhat of an interesting synopsis to kind of set up here, and maybe one which isn't seen regularly, I would suggest. You know, having a kind of a character right at the beginning of the movie kind of being diagnosed with cancer, I think gives the character some weight, and everyone kind of knows someone who has suffered with cancer, and I feel that definitely kind of gives some kind of way of, you understand maybe what's kind of going on and the kind of the way that this kind of woman is kind of feeling, which makes her a sympathetic kind of lead kind of character here. And her relationship with her girlfriend, you know, seems initially kind of quite good, and they seem like a kind of a good couple. And you feel the kind of the awkwardness when she's kind of going to this party and her friends that she doesn't really know this kind of her girlfriend's friends and things like that. I think there is some interesting kind of dynamics at play here, and the kind of the story that kind of goes on without kind of spoiling anything. Like I've said, I think has an interesting and strange kind of twist. This movie definitely has a bizarreness about it in a lot of ways. And so if you like something a little bit kind of off kilter, which isn't trying to be art house or anything like that, it's just a little bit of a kind of a weird movie in some ways. But I gotta say, I thought the ideas behind it were the seeds of a pretty good idea here. As I've mentioned, the movie is very low budget, but I gotta say, I actually quite enjoyed the effects. Now, I'm not going to go as far as to say they are great effects, or even good effects in some instances. Some of the effects I thought were okay, but they're certainly interesting. And that might sound like a weird kind of backhanded compliment, but I found this kind of movie's creativeness quite interesting, because there's clear, and we're going to come on to it in lots of other ways, that this movie is very, very low budget. So I have to say I was quite intrigued by the bizarreness of the aesthetics, certainly of the kind of the last act here, with some grotesque and pretty effective in some circumstances kind of gore effects and things like that. I mean, they are definitely a mixed bag, and like I said, I wouldn't necessarily say good, but certainly interesting. And I would actually say there are a couple of sequences here that were done to a disturbing level. You kind of think, oh, that's a little bit kind of gross and things like that. So if you like gross out body horror, I think maybe this one you want to check out in some ways. The movie is relatively short as well, so it's not a particularly kind of long time commitment. And I did like some of the kind of the technical aspects in regards to the kind of the sound effects. And even though I think the music was quite good. Okay, but let's transition into what doesn't work. A lot of this stuff, I feel, comes from its clearly amateurish production and low budget. Now, you can still get away with some low budget, you can still have a low budget movie and still make it an intriguing plot. You know, you can still have good writing, you can still have good acting. So some of this kind of like the blame that I feel this movie might say is down to budgetary reasons is true in some aspects, but not of others. So on a budgetary scale, there are clearly some kind of technical issues here. I feel the, for example, they haven't overdubbed certain lines. It's clearly just picking up ambient dialogue where people are kind of talking, so we'll be hearing dialogue. People sound very far away and quite kind of quiet in sometimes. I don't know if they didn't use microphones and things like that, or boom mics, and just had like the mic and the camera and things like that. So there is definitely some technical issues in regard to some of the audio here, particularly the dialogue kind of scenes that kind of give it this amateurish, kind of cheap kind of feel to it. And even in regards to, I would say, sometimes like the camera is a little out of focus from time to time. There's some kind of awkward edits, here and there, things like this. So again, it just doesn't have that level of professionalism and feels kind of quite amateur. I feel maybe the biggest issue here is going to be the acting, however, because I think the acting really is, unfortunately, pretty poor across the board. There are a couple of sequences, and I would say mainly involving our main two actresses, this couple, where I felt sometimes the acting was okay, but a lot of the time, even with those, the acting is quite poor. I always like to look at the people's body acting when they're kind of there, and there's lots of instances here where, people are just kind of like, don't know what to do with their arms. They're kind of like swinging them kind of round in the sort of party scenes where kind of people are introduced. And it just makes the scene look kind of really awkward. These are people who haven't had a lot of acting experience, I would wager, or not even actors by trade and things like this. It's just, the acting here, unfortunately, is sometimes quite cringy, and it's not helped by some horrible dialogue as well. There are some sequences here where the dialogue just seems so like, it might look good on a page, as Harrison Ford once has said to George Lucas, but you can't say that shit. And that's the case of this movie. Speaking of dialogue, there is a little bit too much kind of information dumps, if that makes sense. We have these kind of like exposition pieces where people are just kind of telling us stuff and telling us kind of information rather than kind of having really anything on the screen. It's a lot of kind of tell don't show with this movie, certainly until the very, very kind of like finale, really. And again, it doesn't make for particularly kind of an interesting movie. I think you can get away with that, but you've got to have solid writing and solid performances if you're going to go down that path. And this one clearly doesn't have the budget to have, sequences showing you what they're talking about, but it also doesn't have the kind of the writing or the actors to kind of have these kind of long exposition scenes and kind of telling you about this as well. The movie's pacing is also very strange. The movie isn't long. I mean, if you take the credits, it's probably around 70 odd minutes, 72 minutes, something along the lines of that. So it's a relatively kind of short film. But the pacing is very strange because certainly the first act of the movie feels very slow, and there's long drawn out sequences that seem to go on for a long, long time and seem very unnecessary. We have this drive back from this kind of like woodland area, and we have our main character just kind of look out the window, and I thought it was going to be like, a couple of seconds to show she's kind of like, melancholy and in thought and stuff like that, but it's like this. It felt like a 5-minute sequence of just her looking out the window and a couple of, few shots of the kind of the car and things like this. And it just went on forever. And so there's sequences here that feel drawn out and don't really kind of progress a story. But at the same time, when we get to the kind of the third act and our climax, it just kind of happens straight away. And it's almost like hitting a wall, because like, it's going to a quite slow dialogue-driven movie, and all of a sudden we kind of introduce this kind of like this body horror element, and this is where the kind of the comparison to society comes in. And like I said, I thought some of the ideas here were quite inventive, but it just seems to happen like with a drop of a dime, really, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And when we kind of get into that kind of sequence, the story just seems super kind of contrived and doesn't really make a lot of narrative sense. It just kind of like just goes, you know, it just kind of like changes up things into a weird kind of like state of affairs where certain characters seem to, their allegiances kind of change and they seem to have different point of views and things like this. And to me, it was a real mess. I mean, it was visually interesting, I got to say, but I thought narratively it was really kind of weak. Unfortunately, so this movie feels like it's probably a first draft of a film in some ways. You know, it feels like the Hale brothers have had an idea, but they've not refined it, and they've kind of just kind of gone ahead and made it. Not had a huge amount of prep time. I don't think the direction is particularly kind of strong. The actors just seem to kind of like just flail around, not knowing what they're doing. And unfortunately, the acting is ultimately kind of not engaging, with a couple of maybe a couple of sequences where I thought were okay, but for the most part, it's all pretty bad. I'll give it props for trying to do something a little bit kind of unique and kind of have some interesting ideas, but ultimately, it's a little bit more difficult to watch. I'll give it a 3 out of 10, so a couple of stars for effort, but I feel the result is rather unsatisfying. A 3 out of 10, have you seen it? What did you think? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.